on Beyond Boundaries. Beyond Boundaries is the series of virtual sessions initiated by Takshila Educational Society to further ideas that foster learning, self-expression, and ingenuity. We at Takshila are keen on connecting young minds to an unbound range of themes, thoughts, and perspectives that facilitate their understanding of the world and its concerns. These sessions bring articulate speakers from the world of art, education, literature, science, and beyond to engage your time and mind. In today's session, Riding with Bapu, How to Befriend a Mahatma, our speaker, Mr. Riyaz Tayyibji, shares his experience in restoring Gandhiji's bicycle at the Sabarmati Ashram, Ahmedabad in 2017. Mr. Riyaz is a well-known architect who takes keen interest in architectural research, documentation, and restoration. He is the principal architect and partner at Anthill Design in Ahmedabad and is leading the NIUA Heritage Management Project for the Walled City. Mr. Tyabji is a grandnephew of Gandhiji's associate, Abbas Tyabji, and has studied at Cathedral and John Connon School, Mumbai, and School of Architecture, CEPT University. He has also served as associate professor at the CEPT University, a visiting instructor at Ecole Speciale, Paris, and as the coordinator for the Gandhi Heritage Sites Mission, a project to document 34 buildings associated with the life of Gandhiji. Mr. Tayyibji has also curated exhibitions and published a guide on the architecture and urbanity of Ahmedabad. Over to Mr. Riyaz. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible clearly. Yes, I'd just like to thank the Takshila Education Society and particularly Sanjeev Bhai for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you also Shraddha and Chetna for coordinating and Simran for this wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank Rutraj at Matter, who seems to be instrumental in getting me into such situations of giving talks that I'm not necessarily qualified for. I'd like to also thank Alan, whose beautiful watercolor sketch has become the poster for this talk, and in some sense is the illustration that I'm going to start with. I'll just share my screen. I hope the screen is visible. So I'd just like to start by saying that I'm here actually very much by chance. I had never had any kind of reason to be deeply involved with Gandhiji's writings or his work. I knew him, like many people do, as a figure in history that we study as part of our course on independence and about the freedom movement. Though I must say that at home, where I come from, as Simran mentioned, I have a familial collection. Abbas Tyabji was a very close associate to Gandhiji, and therefore when we were growing up, there were certain stories at home that you heard from your grandparents who were also involved in one way or the other in the freedom movement. And therefore there was a certain kind of, Gandhiji being part of the family. There were also family stories of him having applied to the family firm as a lawyer and having been rejected. Now, these were all family stories that were, we don't know whether they were really historically factual, but they made good stories. And as Salman Rushdie says, stories are the glue of a family. And so I grew up with these stories around, and Bapu, as I will call him through this lecture, was somebody that seemed close at hand. But like everybody else in high school, we knew Gandhiji and Bapu through photographs like this that appeared in your history textbooks and so on. He seemed a kind of distant historical figure, though still very much in the imagination of the time that we were studying. He was a man on a pedestal of the father of the nation, the Mahatma. And over time, the photographs were replaced by images like this, which would appear twice a year, one on his death anniversary and one on his birth anniversary. And they seem to get, and Gandhiji and our imagination seemed to recede, and we didn't think very much of him as time went on. And the images of him got more and more abstract and more vacuous. They became almost signs which were empty and then could be filled in to be appropriated in ways that that were perhaps not as how would you say authentic as the photographs and the expression of his smile and the baldness of his head, which was very much part of the image of the man that we grew up with. But he slowly receded and became a sign. The other kind of narrative of students like us who were growing up in the 80s was that there was in Bombay, where I grew up, there was the labor strikes, and there were the labor strikes, and there was Datta Samant, and there was Hartal. And as school-going students, as perhaps for many of you, every time there was a Bombay Bandh, it was actually no more than a school holiday. And yet, on the dining table, we would hear amongst the business class that we were perhaps part of, or were social with, that this is all Gandhiji's fault. Every time you don't like something, you go up not revolt, but you go up in opposition. You shut everything down. You quit. If you don't quit India, you quit the mills. And there was this kind of chat, and this was the kind of place that he held in our imagination. I remember that as we entered our architectural education, Gandhiji receded even further. He was not at all a part. His ideas of modernity or of living were not at all a part of the modernity that we were studying in the architecture that was post-independence. And these were all concrete, pakka buildings that were meant to be lasting forever. There were big projects like dams and institutions of a certain type, educational as well. But these all had a certain aesthetic that seemed very, very far from Gandhiji. And it was actually quite by chance. And I have to tell you that I am, it's a big problem that Gandhiji seems to be following me everywhere. And he makes his presence felt in the most unexpected spaces. And I will tell you as we go through the narrative why I think this is not such a happy situation. The first encounter with Gandhiji after my architectural education was a competition that we won as a practice, which was called the Mahatma Gandhi Antarrashtriya Hindi Vishwavidyalaya based in Wardha. The project had its own story, but what it did do was it brought us in. It was for the first time that I visited Wardha and saw the architecture of Gandhiji's ashram there. I had seen the ashrams in Ahmedabad, the Sabarmati Ashram as a student, but the ones in Wardha, the buildings in Wardha, caught me totally unawares. These were incredibly intimate buildings. This is actually Gandhiji's toilet, which was for an architect, recently graduate architecture student, absolutely astounding. They had an intimacy, they had a kind of careful detailing. Everything that architects want to deal with was there in this space. And there was, of course, the historical background to this, that, during his morning chores of cleaning and shitting, Gandhiji would dictate letters of national importance and for the independence movement through the window that you see at the back to his secretary, and he would be doing his chores. And this is incredibly modern in the way if one thinks about his relationship with his body and our image of the relationship of our image of Gandhiji's body is actually one which is very traditional, one which is clad, loincloth clad, bare bodied. And here you got a sense that this is actually a man who is very comfortable with his body, is actually created a space, the toilet, where we are closest to our body in a very sensuous way. And one thinks about the modern toilets that we design with all these fancy tiles, and it can't be colder, more distant from the sensuousness and the touch and the feel and the tactility of the way the body is. And this really got me thinking about whether the man is traditional and whether these buildings are traditional or there is a certain type of modernity to it. Because when you visit the Bapu Kutir in Wardha, you can't, though it is made in materials which are traditional, when one actually looks at the organization of the building, they are very modern in their way. But I won't get too much into the architectural side of things, but this is just to say that Gandhiji appeared quite by chance, but through a set of circumstances, and started asking in my head very, very strange questions about things that I had taken for granted about modernity or what modern life was. And when we returned to Ahmedabad, we started drawing and thinking a little bit more deeply about the ashram that was there. And these are sketches of the upper sketch is actually one of the space outside Hriday Kunj, and the lower one is of the modern building that the famous architect Charles Correa has designed. And you can see through the sketches, we found that there's a certain hardness to one and a softness to the other. And we started asking questions about this. And this was a very strange kind of realization that there are other types of modern buildings that may not look as modern. They may not be made in the same material as those modern buildings, but they are equally modern. And of course, there was the simplicity and the frugality and absolute sheer beauty of these spaces. And then you found out that it was Gandhiji who actually designed and made these buildings, which made you think that was the man an architect. And this was a very troubling thought because he was a freedom fighter, he was the father of the nation. And now you had come to the conclusion that he was also perhaps capable of being an architect. And it was at this point in time, when all these questions were coming up, that a very strange series of circumstances took place. And these are the characters who were instrumental and are at fault for that circumstance where I was invited to become the coordinator of the Gandhi Heritage Sites Mission, which was a project that was meant to document the buildings of Gandhiji across India. We were hoping that it would also be South Africa and London and all those nice fancy places, but it wasn't to be. And during this, while we were documenting the architecture in Shimla, the architecture in the south of India, the architecture, of course, in Gujarat and Bombay, there was a cycle that was found in the library of the ashram. Now, let me introduce you to the characters here. The bearded gentleman that you see in the center at the bottom is Professor Neelkanth Chaya. He is an eminent architect, a teacher, was the dean of the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad at CEPT University. At that point in time, he was the architect to the ashram. Next to him on the left side is the very well-known Gandhian scholar, Dr. Pradip Surud, who is now the provost of CEPT University. At that time, he was the director of the ashram. You will see me on the cycle there, but above are the four people who I will get into in detail later. Our meetings were largely about these buildings and the documentation process around them. When Pradip Surud, I will refer to him as Pradip Bhai, said that you are known to be a motorcyclist and interested in all things with two wheels. My father has genetically passed on this bug that keeps us interested in motorcycles. I grew up that is our home in Bombay, where the motorcycle is brought into the house and is repaired from time to time, and that is him and me on a ride. But my childhood was spent actually navigating spaces like this in the city of motorcycle workshops where mechanics would repair these bikes. Many times in those days, unlike today, where you can order parts of well-known motorcycles online, those days you couldn't. So you would have to go, if a part, particularly if you had an imported motorcycle, if a part got spoiled, you would go into such areas, find fabricators and people who would be willing to make them, copy them, refurbish the bike. And I have always enjoyed this side of the city and navigating it in order to kind of find people who will help me maintain my motorcycle. And so when the project of the restoration of the cycle came to me, I was very happy. You don't say, that when somebody says that, will you restore Gandhiji's cycle? You don't say, I'll think about it. You jump at that opportunity. And it's not, but it wasn't because it was Gandhiji's cycle. It was just a very, very beautiful cycle. And I didn't actually, for a long time, it didn't register the importance of this. In fact, you will find that I didn't document the process of restoration very well. It didn't seem important to look at what I was doing at that point in time. The cycle was in pretty bad shape. It probably had been lying for at least 30 years. It was a rust bucket, and you can see that in these photographs. Everything was jammed. The tires were flat. The chain was absolutely rock solid. I put the cycle into a rickshaw and took it home. And for many months, it lay in our apartment. It's not that you can allow such a cycle to lie in the parking. And over time, one thought about how one would go about this project. I had a Dutch friend who was staying with us at the time, and he was wondering what this junk of a bicycle is doing up in our bedroom. And when I told him it was Mahatma Gandhi's bicycle, he thought I was just absolutely taking the mickey out of him. But then it occurred to me that in his kind of context, a project of this type would have probably gone through a huge museographical process where there would have been experts on the job who would have done a deep research on the metallurgy of the cycle, etc., etc. And it would have been a very different type of process that would have unfolded. I didn't know how to go about this. And when we restore motorcycles, my father and myself, largely it is people on the street and the kind of workshops that I showed you who we go to. Painters, metal workers, denters, and so on. In that sense, you use the city as a resource in order to get various things done. I used to go under this bridge. This is in Gujarat College in Ahmedabad, to a mechanic by the name of Mukesh Bhai. And so while at one point in time, my motorcycle was being repaired, I told him I need somebody who will help me restore this cycle. I had a cycle wala who we used to go to who would help us with the mechanical parts, but the denting of this particular cycle was very important, the metal work. And, denting, though it sounds like a very simple job, is when you've got complex curves on the bodywork of motorcycles and cycles, it becomes quite a delicate job when it needs to be done well. So I was looking for a denter who was a real craftsman. And Mukesh Bhai told me that you must go to Nazir Bhai. Nazir Bhai is the only such person in the city. And he sat actually very close to this bridge. And we went to Nazir Bhai, and Nazir Bhai he looked at me and just said, no, I will not do this. So this kind of put a spoke in the wheel. But Nazir Bhai was known to have trained other people. And it took Mukesh Bhai 3 months of me visiting him, going back and forth, taking my bike for service, for him to finally admit that he knew one of the students of Nazir Bhai, and that there is actually only one student of Nazir Bhai, and that is Anis Bhai. And Anis Bhai was known because of this particular motorcycle that you're seeing on screen. He had crafted each fin in brass, and you can see the quality of workmanship that is happening on the street. And he took me to see Anis Bhai, and he said that Anis Bhai is the kind of person who will be able to help you on this project. Now, this is the kind of side of the city that one is, navigating. One is inhabiting, when one is doing this kind of work. These are, I mean, all of you must be very familiar with the laris and the working food eateries and the bhojanalays and so on and so forth, that actually serve the kind of work that needed to be done. And I find this a hugely exciting space to be a part of, and to kind of engage with in both the work that we do architecturally, but in this project it was very necessary. So these are the four principal characters in my story today. The first one that you see is actually Anis Bhai, who I just told you about how Mukesh Bhai finally introduced me to him. He has a very small workshop, and you guys might have seen this all the time. You may not know very much about it, but I wish I had taken photographs of the first day that I went and met him, because this is actually a photograph taken during the lockdown, because people started asking me about this project. So I went and documented these. So, but this is empty. The day that I went there, there were Mercedes and BMWs parked outside. He does denting work. He's very, very well known. Does all these fancy cars which are parked on the street. But his actual shop is that little blue shutter that you see over there, which is about 4 feet deep, and he pays a princely rent of 6,000 rupees in order to keep his tools and all his stuff there while he works there. He actually uses other people's workshops as well in order to do odds and ends, whether it's drilling and welding, or whether it's kind of painting. He will use his space, etc., etc. So there's a whole community of, you can say, small scale industry that's going on here. And when I reached there, and you can also see that on the left-hand side, there's a bhojanalaya. So when we reached there, Anis Bhai wasn't there. So we waited for him. And when Anis Bhai came, he was quiet. And Mukesh Bhai explained to him that, this man needs to restore a cycle. So I added that, it's Gandhiji's cycle. So at the best of times, Anis Bhai is quiet. So he didn't say much. And finally, he agreed that he would restore the cycle. And he said, but there will be 3 conditions. The first condition is that there will be no money involved, that this is for Bapu. And that was the first time I actually started thinking of it as Bapu's cycle. Till then, it was Gandhi's bike. And there was a certain kind of intimacy, like certainly like Gandhiji is like, this is near CN Vidyalaya, Gandhiji lives in the ashram, uska cycle bigad gaya, hum log repair karke de denge Bapu ke. It was that kind of sense. And he says, Bapu ke liye to paise nahi le sakte. And that was the kind of first condition. The second condition was that when the bicycle would be ready, and when it was in public, that I had to promise him that it would be published in a local daily paper, and that his name would be attributed to the work done. So that I grudgingly agreed to, because I didn't know what else to do. And the third condition was that I would not tell him how to do the work, that I should not pretend to know what it means to do metal work, that I should simply let him do his job. And that really struck me, because there was a real craftsman telling me that if you come to me, this is my work. You don't give me the work and then tell me how to do. And this is Anis Bhai working on a Jeep restoration on the street, and this is him working on that cycle. Now I had actually gone to him saying only the mudguards need to be straightened out and so on, but he stripped everything off. He started with the frame, realigned everything, reworked the holes, filled them up with weld, re-drilled them, re-tapped them, set everything up so that it was in a perfect line level. He worked 4 or 5 nights after his normal shift on this cycle restoration till everything was not up to my mark. My mark was actually much lower than his, till he was happy with what the shape of things were. And this is him working through the evening and night on the project. The second person that I want to introduce you all to is Sendaji. Sendaji Thakur is actually the guy who sits on the street and repairs cycles. You will all be familiar with it. Maybe some of you even go there to repair your cycles. I don't know. When we were kids, we would go to such places. In the 80s, you could hire a cycle for $1 an hour. and go cycling with your friends. I mean, this was the epitome of freedom. This was like what it meant to kind of leave home and be away from the protection of your parents and explore the city. These were the kind of people who excited you, and of course, if you had a cycle of your own, this is where you would go to get it repaired. And if there was a rattle, or if there was a kind of loose part, you would stick some paper in and tighten it and do some jugaad in order to kind of keep it going. These were the places where you learned all the hacks that there were about how to keep that cycle going. And these hacks were visible on Gandhiji's cycle. You could see that that bracket had some paper, and there was some cigarette packet card which was served him. We would chuckle about it. Ki Gandhiji ka cigarette packet tha ya what? And whether one should consider that as part of the heritage project, or whether that is some contamination of the cycle, or is that a record of the usual things that you do when you have the cycle. What if that was put in at the time of Gandhiji? Isn't that of great importance? And these, of course, had great resonance with the kind of conservation projects that we were supposed to do for the Gandhi Ashram in the documentation of his buildings. Gandhiji's buildings are made in mud. That mud has to be kind of renewed and taken care of every year. In the villages, you must have heard that they do lippan. They put wet mud every year of cow dung in order to renew the floor. So if I take a measurement today, will it be 1 inch more next year? What will we consider the authentic record? What should we consider the original thing? These were all the kind of crazy questions that Gandhiji was asking us when we were doing this cycle. And that's why I tell you that I really didn't want Gandhiji to be following me around. He makes you ask very difficult questions about everything you're doing. At the end of the day, this was a cycle. And all these questions were coming up in its restoration. Finally, I just decided that the way that we were, the kind of logic that we used when we were restoring motorcycles, is that at the end of the day, you want to use it, you want to ride it. That it's something that you want to be able to continue using. And that's the attitude with which we went ahead with the restoration. And so the idea was that if Gandhiji had the cycle today, he walked into a street side cycle wala's dukan, got it repaired, and took it home. That's the way we did it. So Sendaji was a very important person in this. He was the guy who Gandhiji takes the cycle to, and Sendaji opens it up. Only in this case, because it's Gandhiji's cycle and it's happening at my home, we do it in the bedroom. And this is the only kind of curated photograph taken in that entire project, where all the parts were laid out. And this is where you hear that voice of Gandhiji inside you, that what he calls the still little voice. And you're wondering, why did I take this photograph? Is it because I am one of those who didn't trust Sendaji, that the parts would not all come back to me? Am I one of those elite, detached people who don't trust the common people who do the work that we need to get done? And then am I also equally happy with taking credit for all of this, as I am doing now? Sendaji is not here giving this talk, I am. And all these very difficult questions started coming up, later when I looked at this photograph as to why was I doing this? When Sendaji did open up the cycle, something very interesting happened. We found that the sprocket, the front sprocket of the pedal, actually had the insignia, the sign of the Indian National Congress, the open hand. And what was interesting was on the pedal, which you see on the right side, was embossed in the rubber, freedom. Now you can imagine the excitement. Gandhiji's cycle, Indian National Congress ka sign, freedom written on the pedal. Of course, there were all kinds of corny jokes with those other guys, Tridip Surud and Neelkanth Chaya, about pedaling to freedom and all kinds of nonsense like that. Okay, and there was, of course, when you get a bunch of architects interpreting, some kind of symbolic form here, open hand, there are 12 spokes over there. Each spoke has 5 teeth. So you've got 60 teeth on that. So like this whole kind of, I don't know if you guys had to study Konarak temple and that wheel, So I remember in the 10th grade having to kind of ratto that interpretation that the 12 spokes are 12 hours and or 12 months, and 60 these things would be the minutes of the hours, etc. All of that. So you got this kind of complex interpretative game that you could get into. And it's all very exciting that suddenly this whole thing is adding up to this narrative of a freedom bike. Even if actually we know that this bike probably didn't belong to Gandhiji, that it belonged to Amrutlal Shelat, a student studying at Nai Talim at the ashram, who probably allowed Gandhiji to borrow the bike for 10 minutes when that famous photograph was taken in 1928. That's how, but suddenly, because there's this narrative around it, because there's freedom and the Indian National Congress ka sign, and the bike was found in the ashram, suddenly this whole thing has another meaning. It doesn't matter whether Gandhiji actually owned the bike or not. There is a certain kind of, how would you say, there's a certain kind of substance to the whole narrative. I'll take you now to the third person involved, and this is Praveen Zapadia. Praveen Zapadia actually works in my office. Praveen is, his story is incredible. His mother used to be help at our home, who used to come to wash dishes. She came one day to me to say that Praveen has failed his BCom, and he joined our office. Today, our office wouldn't run without Praveen. He makes models. The one on the right is the model of Hriday Kunj, which actually was made professionally. He manages our sites. He actually runs a business. He's a CEO of, what is it called? Blue Hawk, and manufactures diaries and sketchbooks for the architectural community in Ahmedabad, and he ships them all over the country. If you want really nice diaries and sketchbooks, contact Blue Hawker. But this is the kind of city that this is the part of the city that he traverses in order to get this done. These are the kabadi markets of Ahmedabad, where binding and paper are sold, and he knows how to navigate it. And so Praveen is this ingenious fellow who's working in an office with architects who have moleskin diaries, very branded and imported, and he's making these, learning from them and all the other international brands, and getting them made in khadi. And he learned this in an industrial area, how to get things done, how to work with designers, how to work with people who are making things, and he makes them himself now. Started navigating various parts of the city so that he can get many different things made. And he was the one who actually found the fourth character in our story, that is Ajit Bhai, who had a sandblasting unit very close to where we had our office at the time. And he found him, and when he told him that Gandhiji's cycle needs to be sandblasted, because what we decided was that really to scrape by hand would damage the metal. We would actually sandblast it down and then take a call on how it needs to be painted and chromed and so on and so forth. And this is the incredible space of that work, where both powder coating and sandblasting is done. And this is what it looked like. So the photograph on the left side is really how all the same parts looked when they came back from sandblasting. And this is the frame. But the frame, we couldn't figure out which was the make of the bicycle, because you can see that the label has been ground down, and there is no way of finding out what the kind of name was. So it allowed us to continue to think that open hand was the monogram of the Indian National Congress, and that the cycle was something that we could really decipher. It did not look like a rally or a BSA that used to come from Birmingham. If you look at the welding over there, it looked like it'd been done in a local workshop. And we built narratives of it. In fact, historical study, when we got into, suggested that the first cycles in the right up to 1903 were actually the cycle industry, and actually all import was controlled by the British. Indians weren't allowed to be in import business, and it was in 1903 that you have the first ever bicycle shop run by an Indian. And this was these really interesting guys, Hemendra and Jitendra Mohan Bose, they were, pioneers in photography and gramophone technology, cycles. They went on to get into cars, and they started something called the Great Eastern Motors in Calcutta, and so on and so forth. And these guys were the first to import American, German, French, and British cycles. They were very Swadeshi, so they preferred not to import English ones. And even in their car shop, they preferred importing French cars than English ones. And this is how it went on. By 1920-21, India was importing 47,000 bicycles a year. And in the next decade, it was over 100,000. So in 1928, when Gandhiji's that photograph was taken, there was a lot of bicycles coming into this country. But the interesting thing was that these bicycles weren't necessarily being brought in whole. They were being brought in parts and being assembled here in small workshops like the ones that I showed you of Sandaji, in places like Ludhiana, Malerkotla, Punjab. All of these places, there was the equivalent of the Charana Dukan that was doing this kind of mechanical putting together, very similar to the kind of shops and cycle walas that I showed you on the street that were putting together these cycles. And given how good we are with Jugaad, we had built. When I say we as were restoring the cycle, I had built this whole narrative that this fits perfectly in with this independence, nationalistic narrative, where what was happening was that, and there is a documentation that Gandhiji had actually suggested to someone to start a kit cycle company in Rajkot, where the components were made in the factory and they were then, like Firefox, sent across the country, and they could be welded and put together in various village workshops, giving work to those areas. So a very interesting kind of history, and it kind of fitted into this narrative of the open hand and so on and so forth. The problem is facts. After I wrote that story and it got published, I got two very interesting phone calls. The first one was from a gentleman who knew the history of the sign of the Congress, and he pointed out a very interesting chronological deficiency in my narrative, which was that the open hand only became the sign of the Congress after 1978. That prior to that it was the cow and the calf, and prior to that it was two interlocked bulls. So clearly that open hand could not be the Indian National Congress. But who lets facts come in between a good story, right? That's the mantra of today. But I got a second. If you get one fact, it's a problem, but you can perhaps dismiss it. You shouldn't, but you can't do that if you get another one. So I got another call from a Parsi gentleman in Bombay saying that, talking about how much he enjoyed the story and so on and so forth, but that he had recognized the open hand as the sign of the Raj Whitworth company, which was one of the most important motorcycle companies. And I did know about Raj as a motorcycle maker. I just didn't know that it also made bicycles. But the thing was that they made Britain's best bicycles by the appointment to His Majesty the King. And these bicycles are amongst the oldest manufacturers in the world. They go back to the Pew family, I think 1891, they were kind of manufacturing, and then they had an amalgam of Raj and Whitworth, etc., etc. This is now easily available on the internet. But the interesting thing was that this was really a very, very sophisticated cycle. When we started doing the research, once we knew what the manufacturer, it only sent our narrative about the national movement out of the window. But the Raj was really a sophisticated, and I'll just read this part out. The Raj was really a sophisticated bicycle for its time. It would have patented adjustable bearings on both wheels. I've given you the patent number, with pencil type hubs, oil bath in the case, so that the chain would run through an oil bath, so it would always be kind of lubricated. And what I did notice was Bapu's bike still had the original what they called proportional coupling system and braking system, which allowed you to apply brakes on either brake lever, and mechanically it would apply the right proportion for safety in emergencies and absolute freedom from skidding, as it was advertised at the time. This was an incredible cycle, and more research would suggest that the cycle is a 1937 Model 38 and Model 78. Now we have a problem here. This cycle, the photograph is taken in 1928. If we are to follow the narrative and the manufacturer's narrative, the bicycle is a 1937 model. So that leads to a very disturbing conclusion that perhaps Gandhiji is not riding the cycle that I restored. This is not much fun. But there is another possibility. And this goes back to those little shops that we were talking about, and to the historical situation where a large number, and in fact the majority of imports, were of parts of bicycles at the time and not of the cycle as a whole. And that in fact, in a kind of ship of Theseus scenario, parts could have been changed over time, because carefigure Edulji, who had made the call to me to bring to my notice the manufacturer, also from the photographs had come to the conclusion that the chain guard and the mud guards were not that from our original drudge. So there were many, many parts which didn't belong to the cycle, even if we assumed its manufacturer. Now the kind of narrative was becoming very, very complex. And we didn't know whose cycle or what cycle this was, or whether it was a one which was put together in many parts. Knowing our ingenuity and our ability to jugaad, one can imagine that in order to be competitive, many of these workshops, the little workshops in Ludhiana, Malerkotla, Delhi, Bombay, everywhere, would have developed a supply of locally manufactured parts, copies, like we always do, of British, American, German, and Japanese parts made at a fraction of their cost. These would not only have made the indigenous bicycles more affordable, but also fueled the first wave of Make in India. In addition, the basic parts of the bicycle could be reconfigured to perform a number of other works and to create vehicles that were local and unique. As David Arnold writes, bicycles were adapted by local blacksmiths to make 3 or 4-wheeler carts for transporting and selling goods, as well as make cycle rickshaws. In the 1920s, one enterprising firm offered for sale a patent water cycle whose only use appeared to be for duck shooting. The bicycle's saddle, pedal, crank, and chain could provide the mechanism for an experimental foot-powered loom. And one can still see today on the streets of Mumbai or Ahmedabad a knife grinder who raises his bicycle onto its stand and then uses the pedal and crank to turn a grinding wheel attached to the frame. The bicycle became a front for further local inventiveness. Now, this is the kind of incredible thing that we see all around us. So to assume that this should, for some reason, be a pure Rudge Whitworth cycle, and that parts were not changed later that were available in the 30s or the 40s or even later, is not an argument that's how would you say, it's an argument worth considering as to what if this is a jugaad cycle that was put together with many different parts that came at that time. And you all know this. We see this everywhere we go, and it's not only with cycles; it's with chagadas. Okay, this is Saurashtra and Kutch. You will find these strange vehicles, right? I mean, you don't see any kind of advertisements for this, and yet if you were to go into these regions, these are localized transport means that are fantastic. And I like to think that Gandhiji would have loved this. I like to think that this thing, which is actually in Madhya Pradesh called a jugaad, which has an incredibly detachable water pump. which is used as its engine. So that when it is taken into the agricultural fields, it can be used as a water pump for agriculture. It can be put back onto this frame, and then it can be used to take agricultural produce from here to there. It is also, as you are seeing here, being used as a taxi on the highway. So in non-agricultural seasons, it is used for other types of earning. And I was thinking that this is an incredible thing, that this is multiple use with the same by reconfiguring, and it's a form of frugality. And frugality we normally talk about in terms of not using too much, using less. But this was another type of definition when you start looking at mix and match, what Gandhi cycle suggested. When you look at like being able to do many things with that, it's another type of frugality. And I mean, you find strange machines. This is a Ganne ka Ras, Shedino Ras machine roaming the streets of Ahmedabad, put together by a local craftsman. This used to be put together by Italian craftsmen, not anymore. And certainly there's no multiplicity here. The Ferrari is a fit for purpose speed machine. It is made for one thing only, and is made for speed. And this occurred to me when we were looking at Gandhiji's cycle, but also these vehicles, which are at the back of my mind, that if you want to do multiple things, then efficiency is not a very good idea, because efficiency means identifying one thing and then doing it efficiently. But if I'm doing many things, then there's got to be a trade-off. There's got to be a kind of ability to do things, but not necessarily perfectly. The important thing is the material that you use, that is saved. This is only, so if you have a Ferrari, you will need 3 other cars at least, right? Because if you want to travel, you will need another type of car, and so on and so forth. I would suggest that we are actually designing everything like that in our modern world. And this is a very modern car. And in our cities, we have fit for purpose, singularly efficient buildings, cities, roads. It occurred to me while traveling in Europe, why where have all the bullock carts gone? There was a time, you read about it in literature and in history, when there were gypsies traversing the roads and highways of Europe. Where have they gone? And how come those highways have become so efficient? And even more so, the question occurred to me, and this is Gandhiji at it again, playing in your head. How come we've come to appreciate that and not the multiplicity and the ingenuity and the inventiveness that is here? This maniness is something that I think is absolutely incredible. I mean, we can get, you can say that I'm romanticizing it in this train situation, and perhaps that's true. But I was on a motorcycle ride, the same one I showed you the photograph there. You can see the wheel of my bike over there. And at the petrol pump, we were all like with these biker boots and jackets and so on, saddlebags and all. And we thought we were doing a lot. And there was this guy on a Hero Honda with all those vessels. And talking to him, we asked him how many kilometers a day. He's a traveling salesman, sells utensils all over Madhya Pradesh. Sorry, this was Haryana. Was asked him how many kilometers he does a day. And he said 350. And you ask biker dudes like me how much we plan to do in a day, it'll be about 350. So, I mean, this is there all around us. And this is my favorite story, that washing machine that you see there. So there was this, in the 90s, Onida washing machine. If you guys remember that brand, they found a really strange thing in one of their market surveys, that a small town in Punjab was one of their largest markets. And when they did the market survey, they found that it was being used as a lassi maker. And you think about it, think about the ingenuity. Intake, swirl, outtake. Whether you're washing clothes or making lassi, the basic diagram and relationship is the same. So I can use that maker, that machine for anything that has that same diagram of use. I can use it for many things. And this sensibility is fantastic. This sensibility is what comes out of being very, very intimate with material. And this is the the photographs that you're seeing are the kind of things that we see all around us in this country. This texture, this plenitude, material, manyness. You just have to go to an Adivasi shrine in North Gujarat. This is where it is. Or be in that absolute madness in Mumbai, or recognize that the same thing is at play in our temples or in our old cities. And maybe that's what we also enjoy in these kind of spaces, which are part of our newfound sci-fi spatiality. And so, this whole sense of jugaad, of being very, very close at hand with the material and the processes that you're dealing with, is something that I think Gandhiji was very, very aware of. I don't know if you guys know, but Gandhiji was a craftsman. He came from a Vanya class, which was blue collar, never used their hands, business or ministers. His grandfather, I think, was a chief minister, and his father was also in some kind of ministerial post. So he was in a community that wasn't used to using their hands, but he taught himself. And in that sense, he became very modern. When he went to England, when he went to South Africa, he taught himself carpentry, he taught himself leather. Okay, he taught himself how to work with cloth, the charkha. And it wasn't that he just knew how to spin. He knew the mechanics of the spinning wheel. He was a tinkerer. He made the charkha more efficient. He made it more aerodynamic. He changed the way it worked. He designed the charkha. He even organized arguably the first international design competition in the country in 1929 for the design of a portable charkha, a laptop charkha, so that you could spin when you travel. He understood modernity. He understood that movement and work in our time was related. But he knew that you had to be close at hand. You had to be a craftsman. You had to have that intimacy to know how much material to use. And in that, I think he would have loved this. He would have loved this, except he would have hated the shoddiness with which that paper is put. Because in the craft system, workmanship is really important. So though he may have done the everyday, the care with which that everyday would be done would be very different in the case of Gandhiji. He would have probably made that buffer out of leather, okay, and cut it perfectly and stitch the edges so that they don't fray. That is perhaps what he would do. I don't know. So to come back to my story, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because these four people who I introduced to, and the different parts and the different roles they played, they put the cycle together. They did the work that was required, and then the cycle was returned to the ashram restored. And exactly 5 years ago, on the 2nd of October 2016, the Prime Minister came to inaugurate the unveiling of this cycle. The director of the ashram kept his word. Anis Bhai, the entire process was published in the local newspaper. Anis Bhai's name was mentioned, his role was articulated. But after that, the media took over. They were the four people who did the work were no longer in the picture. Our Prime Minister came, inaugurated the cycle. A few months later, the cycle was flown to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it was unveiled at the Groot Church in Amsterdam, the new church in Amsterdam, and the Great Church in Den Haag. There were 1,500 people. The Netherlands is a cycle-mad country who co-opted this symbol of Gandhiji. There was an exhibition called Mandela, King and Gandhi, and this was an exhibit as part of that. So suddenly that vacuousness that had become our relationship to Gandhiji was now becoming this relationship to the cycle, where the people who were actually involved slowly receded from the story. And the cycle had a disconnected life of its own. I'm not saying that it's not important, but I'm just giving you the reality that the people who actually restored the cycle, their narrative receded. And I think Gandhiji would have been very upset about this. I think Gandhiji, because he had that sense of craft, that sense of nearness, that sense of engagement, he would have appreciated their contribution, and he would have felt that their narrative being left out is a form of alienation, is a form of injustice, is a form of appropriation by that which is powerful. He would also not like that we spent 13,310 rupees in restoring the cycle, out of which 7,500 rupees was spent on the base. The rest was spent on material. Not one of the 4 people who actually took part in the process took 1 rupee for their own labor to do it. And this is where the relationship, the intimacy with Bapu was so palpable, that all of them had this very direct relationship, that they were doing it for this man whom they could not have possibly met, but who embodied something real for them. And they made it more real in the whole process of restoring this cycle, and they gave off their labor for it. And my sense is that it's this closeness that Gandhiji would have appreciated greatly. And in this closeness of craft, where decision making and the consequence of that decision making very close. If I'm doing something with my own hand, I take a decision, I act on it, and it's almost immediate what the consequences are. When I'm designing, I design today, and then there are 1,000 processes in the middle, the world comes in, and something else comes out. And therefore, it's not an immediate process. And in that sense, what Gandhiji would have thought is that from a very intimate process, where everything is, where action and consequence are very close, suddenly that action has become the consequence of this going to Netherlands and going and being unveiled by the Prime Minister has made things very far. And isn't that where we started with Gandhiji, that he was a figure that was too far away. But through this process, I have found a very personal relationship with Gandhiji. You will have heard of Gandhiji, the freedom fighter, the father of the nation, but you have not heard of Gandhiji, the cyclist, or Gandhiji, the man who does the jugaad. This is my own narrative. And I think to befriend the Mahatma, one must find one's own Bapu. One must make our relationship with that man or any other who has done something significant. One must make that relationship intimate. And that requires a certain kind of engagement. That requires a certain kind of closeness. I would like to end actually with a counterfactual that hopefully addresses the question, which is the title of my talk. Is that the counterfactual is that if Gandhiji had been born in 1969 instead of 1869, he would have been a biker. He would have been a biker. He would have loved motorcycles. He would have loved traversing this this part of the city. He would have loved being with these kind of people. Of course, he would not have had the burden of independence. So he could have perhaps had a few more hobbies. But why I'm saying this is also because he would have loved riding. You know, to ride, I was looking at the meaning of the word ride, is to sit on and control movement or something that's moving, whether it's a horse or a bike or something like that. And it occurred to me that the difference between me, I'm interested and I'm happy with riding motorcycle. Gandhiji would have enjoyed riding the modern world and riding it, controlling it, being controlled by it in balance, because riding always has balance involved. So the thing with riding is that there's this strange duality, contradiction, that you are in control or you hope you are in control, and you are controlled by that machine or that animal. And it's that balance that the writing is really about. And I think Gandhiji would have loved that. He would have loved being able to ride the modern world, and he would have thought about it that way. Whereas we think about it only as a vehicle, he would have thought about it in the scale that a Mahatma does. But as far as I'm concerned, in order to befriend, one must find the Bapu. Thank you.